Well, we're approaching 2019, and as we look to China's challenges, I think Chinese leaders would argue that most of their challenges are domestic. Even though they have a much more ambitious international strategy, the bulk of their focus remains on domestic development, continuing to keep the economy moving, and to improve the livelihoods of their citizens. Having said that, I look quite intensively at their international set of issues, and so I think 2019 for the Chinese, they will want to try as best they can to get the U.S.-China relationship back on track. That first and foremost, the Chinese leader will want to try to address the tensions in the trade space, and what will be important to that in terms of China's own domestic policies will be the question of what happened to the economic reform plan that was announced by President Xi himself in 2013. China joined the WTO in 2001, 17 years ago. The United States advocated for and gave huge amount of support to China's entry into the WTO. At the time, China's economy was 6th or 7th largest in the world. It was not the exporting nation that it is today. And over those past 17 years, there was an expectation from the United States and other international countries, partners in the WTO, that China over time would open its markets to foreign competition, would give the rights to intellectual property that are so important when it comes to innovation and the like. But instead, what we saw over 17 years was China not opening its markets and not protecting intellectual property, and in many cases, forcing companies to transfer their intellectual property to China to be used and integrated and adapted into their own countries. And we also saw China move on a heavy state-led approach, which used industrial policies and large state subsidies to give advantages to their own companies. China's economy, now they're the second largest economy in the world, and by 2030, some reports say China will be the largest. And yet we haven't seen China move on the promises that it made in 2001 to reform. And many in the international community are now saying that if China doesn't move on its reforms, then their companies, including the United States, will not be able to compete fairly with China. So this is not a question of whether or not China can continue to grow. It's a question of how, and how do we compete with a much more powerful China. A lot of American friends say to me, the Chinese leadership must have really negative feelings about President Trump. And I tell them, on one hand, that's true, because he has unloaded $250 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese products coming to the United States. And that puts a lot of pressure. And he also has been unpredictable. So on one hand, the Chinese are very frustrated with President Trump and don't like dealing with him on a day-to-day basis. But at a much higher level, many Chinese experts and officials that I speak to tell me that President Trump is a gift to China. When they see President Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord or pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement, what they see is the United States pulling back from its traditional leadership role in the world. They see the United States, through those actions, lose international credibility. When President Trump talks disparagingly about U.S. allies around the world, whether that's NATO or Japan and Korea in the Asia Pacific, to the Chinese, that's music to their ears. They have complained about our alliance structure for a long time. The truth is, why don't they like it? Because it gives us greater leverage in dealing with China. So of course China wants it to go away. So decisions that President Trump and his administration are making about America's leadership role in the world are giving China greater opportunities in the world, and that they appreciate.